Wow, we didn't even have to say anything. You guys just settled right in post-lunch. Um, Dr. Cook and I are going to be just moderating, I guess, the groups that broke out during the last session before lunch. If you remember, we split off into our taxa groups. So we had reptiles and amphibians in this room. We were the slackers this time, did not take notes, so it's all going to be up here in all of our heads that were in this room. We'll have to call it out. We had fish with Steve. We had the birds over there with Patty and Ellen and Sam. And I guess Mike was probably in your group as well. And then we had mammals upstairs with Dr. Sykes, and I don't know who else was up there with you, but um, just Nicolette was there with you. Great. So I guess we'll just see who wants to report out from their group discussion. Who wants to go first? Get it over with. Patty.
Figure out who else we would tag to do this. So you guys in the bird group, you got away easy because we should have picked one of you. Um, okay, so I'll just go first because maybe then it will be easier to not replicate in some of the other groups. We had a handout that we gave out, sort of a handout. All of those sort of outlines should be on your thumb drive anyway for all the different taxon groups, but because I'm a visual, tactile person, I needed to actually have something to write on. So we kind of went through a list, an outline, scale outline of a lot of different topics. Thanks to Ellen, who speaks poetically about statistics and study design, and thank God she was able to do that. So please excuse me for not trying to meet her expectations, because I can't. But we basically talked about the whole issue in wildlife, and in our case birds, was the difference, if I can get it down to a nutshell, between parametric and non-parametric studies, so that oftentimes you're going out maybe to do an exploratory kind of study. You don't know what the size of the population is. You don't know what the circumstances are for that animal. Again, generically it goes across all the different species. But if you're doing something that's exploratory or observational, trying to identify maybe some natural history of the animal or more about taxonomy, there's all of this stuff which is kind of tough to fit into those 3 R's, right? And the replacement, that goes out the window. I mean, you're trying to go out there and actually know more about that population. You don't want to study something else and reflect or try to make it equivalent to. The same thing with reduction. In many cases, you actually need many more numbers because you have variation in wildlife populations, individual variations, right? They're not the sort of bred for research type animals that maybe in many cases are clonal. So, you have all these sort of confounding variables in trying to put your study design together to begin with. But again, from the IACUC perspective, we can't necessarily hold wildlife and fish and wildlife researchers to those same hardcore principles in a way of, you have to fit the round peg in the square hole. In some cases, because there's individual variation or even within the population's variations based on demography, based on where these distribution and demographics, that we actually probably have to give them more width, right, to have more numbers because they have so much variation in the population. Then we got into a little bit of descriptive statistics. Yeah, okay, never mind. Or inferential statistics. And so my hat's off. What I usually do is I defer to the biostatisticians and ask them for their help. And that came into this discussion about, if a researcher puts in a proposal and says, well, I mean, pretty much my animal number is unknown, or I don't know, so I'm not filling in that box. Well, that's not exactly acceptable. It depends. So some of it may be that if you are, again, doing these observational exploratory studies, maybe that is the sort of latitude that they need because they don't know what that upper number is. On the other hand, there is a role for these biostatisticians. If you either have them on the IACUC committee or you reach out and befriend one, that PI should be working with a biostatistician at least to try to get some sense of what's the minimal number that I should be trying to catch, trap, whatever, if I'm trying to identify some objective in my study. And then there's still an upper limit, as I mentioned the other day. Be careful for our PIs that they should reasonably aim high in what they think the animal numbers could be, because as I mentioned in a study, I was giving an example the other day, is they went out with good intentions to catch 100 fish of some species, and they wound up with 1,000. So how does that reflect back on the IACUC's role and responsibility? Sometimes you just do pilot studies. Sometimes if you don't have good background history and data to try to hone in on some of those 3 Rs, then pilot studies would be one way to try to go out and capture some of that initially and then come back and refine your next study appropriately. So there's all that kind of stuff. Thank you, Ellen. We also then talked a lot, particularly for birds, right, about permitting. And because we have the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, because we have the Bald and Golden Eagle Act, because we have a variety of these permitting conditions when it comes to wild birds. So we went through some of those issues, and again, not to go into the gory details, I guess Ellen might catch her in the hallway if you'd like a further explanation. But the bottom line is there, in particularly with birds, and obviously endangered species crosses over to lots of other species as well, but there are permitting conditions that the IACUC just needs to know about, as we've mentioned earlier today as well. In our situation, again, the IACUC approval can happen, but no animal activities begin until all those permits are in place. We also ask for a copy of the permit, our IACUC does, because in part, I think the comment was make sure your PI has read their permit conditions. And some of this might actually play into whether it happens as emergency euthanasia. Most of these permits, I would say blanketly, don't talk about anything to do with euthanasia at all. So if that's something you might need to talk to your permitting agency about including additional language so that just in case. So all those kinds of things we talked about. Also that numbers are reported back. Certainly actual numbers come back to the IACUC committee at the end of the year when we do our annual review. They also have to get reported back to the permitter, right, the permitting agency. We talked a little bit about permit application time, and just from the perspective of how that reflects on the IACUC is, again, you get a new proposal coming in, and you review it as an IACUC, and you hopefully approve it, but what happens if that PI submits the proposal to the IACUC and at the same time puts in for the permit because they want to get out the door in a month? Okay, so they certainly the PIs I've talked to are wildlife biologists. They know well ahead that actually they got to get that permit application in way in advance, and that may be pending while they're also submitting for IACUC review and approval. We talked a lot about, and Sam was very thorough on trying to go through some of the capture and handling issues for birds. Sometimes, as we talked about a little bit with bats yesterday, I made that mention, is a lot of times if you have partnering opportunities, and this again for the researchers that you deal with, if they're outside and they know that there's another group out there from another university or another agency, and they're already out there capturing or going out to collect some information from a group of animals, maybe there's an opportunity to partner with them so you don't have to go out and capture the same population of animals over and over again. That might be to collect samples, tissues, blood, feathers, etc. So maybe there's an opportunity to partner there and avoid duplication of effort and also avoid the stress. We know this now with a lot of the bats with white nose. Some of these species are already listed as endangered or they're threatened, and it's becoming concerns not only for the biosecurity of getting people in and out of caves and not doing the proper decon. We talked about some of the specific types of capture techniques. I'm not going to go in that now, but all sorts of things to deal with net captures and net guns and Balscher tree traps and all sorts of things. One thing we did also talk about in some of those capture methods, they do use live lure or live bait animals. In some cases, the animal, as we decided, it's like going into a shark cage. Congratulations, little pigeon, or little whatever rodent. You get to be inside the cage, and that big thing with talons is coming at you. So what happens to those bait animals? And before we went on the lunch break, I know I threw that provocative question out, is whether or not it's reportable to USDA if it is a rodent that was not bred for use in research. Yeah, maybe they are being used for research rather than in, and maybe therefore Animal Care's interpretation is that it's not a reportable animal or mammal, but there's also the institutional policy and philosophy. So let's not all just get hung up on what we have to report, as the bigger picture of animal welfare is how do we feel at the institution about the care and the husbandry of those bait or lure animals. If they have to go out into the shark cage, the next day, or there's 3 or 4 of them that you have rotating, what's their husbandry? Don't they have to be fed and watered and cared for because they're housed while they're also being asked to volunteer to go in the shark cage as a lure animal? So again, let's just kind of put all that together. And then there's issues of seasonality that goes across for all the different wildlife we're talking about. The other issue came also with some of the decon or the cleaning of your equipment. So when you're moving your gear from site to site, whether it's mist nets or other types of capture equipment, again, even, what did I say? Wash your hands, right? So cleaning and disinfection is appropriate and important when you're thinking about the capture equipment as all your gear that goes from place to place. Also, sometimes they try to do some predator proofing when they put out some of these traps so that you actually get the animal that you want to trap, but somebody doesn't come along and eat it before you come back. Chemical restraint, we touched on that a little bit too. That kind of goes across all different species, is the issue of chemical restraint. Sometimes people have put, if you know alpha chlorulose, for example, they'll kind of put that out like in food bait and then have the animal eat, that food, the target animal, but you have non-target issues. And also, if you're putting anything in food, as you know, it comes down to dosing. Like, did the animal really eat the entire muffin, or did it only eat part of the muffin, right, or whatever you put it out? We also talked a little bit about emergency and contingency plans for, let's say, emergency field euthanasia. We'll talk more about that tomorrow when we have our euthanasia panel. The idea of how that relates, any of these contingency plans, whether it's injured animals that need to go for a veterinary evaluation, if they can be transported, and I'm specifying birds in this case, so broken leg, broken wing, right? Is that animal salvageable, right? In many cases, it might be. If it has a broken wing in a certain part of the bones, or it may have a broken leg, it might be salvaged. It could be evaluated at a vet facility or at a wildlife rescue facility, and or it might require euthanasia in the field, or maybe just some first aid. How does that relate to your permit conditions? Okay, are you allowed to do any of these things if it's not on your permit? So again, this sort of make sure we have some kind of reconciliation there. And again, how and when to notify those permitting agencies, and how and when to notify your IACUC. So when all goes well in the field, yay! What happens when things don't go well? And in some cases, as much as veterinarians can train our colleagues, our biologists, to go out and do surgeries in the field or do things when we're not really standing by them, if all goes well, that's great, that's success. What happens when things don't go well? So I tend to be the one who plans for the worst case scenario. That's just me personally, and having been involved in a lot of disaster response. So you always have to plan for the worst case scenario. That's just the way I work, and that's the Ben Franklin way, right? If all goes, plan for the worst and hope for the best. The other thing was about post-approval monitoring, and again, specifically to birds, but again, nowadays, if I hear somebody say, well, I don't take a camera in the field with me, I'm like, yeah, you do. You got your cell phone. Come on, you got your iPhone. It doesn't mean that you have to do this in real time and you don't have to stream me your information, but you can, I know they're taking photos for their own purposes. So they can take video or photos, and they can eventually bring that back to the IACUC, whether it's on the annual report or at some other appropriate time. But to give that audio-visual information to the IACUC, that helps us to better support the research so we understand what's going on. And then we talked a little bit about training systems in general, like what are the training systems that exist or don't that have to do with proficiency training, technical training. And there are a few things. Actually, the one that was mentioned, which was a good idea, was TWS, the Wildlife Society, has something called the Certified Biologist. Is anybody in here a certified biologist by any chance? Bob? No? Okay. So they have a good training program. I don't know the details, but we thought that's one place to start, is to look at existing training programs that talk about understanding wildlife, natural history, and also some proficiency training. There's other sort of commercial groups out there, again, whether it's birds or mammals. Safe Capture International does chemical mobilization training. So there's ways to capture the anecdotal, I've been doing like this for 20 years, I know what I'm doing, I'm the expert. Well, I believe you, but I'd also like to see some documentation. And then how often does that training have to be repeated? So in the Safe Capture training, which goes through all sorts of chemical mobilization, drugs, right, having fun with chemicals, the folks that do that will also offer refresher training every couple of years if you want to go back. So that's just another piece of the story. So I think, did I miss anything, Sam or Ellen? Okay. Yes, was there a comment, question, Sam? Oh, thumbs up. Okay, thank you. I couldn't see that far. Okay, thank you.
All right, walk with me this way. We're going to do fish. So Michael Murray and I had a spirited room. I'm not going to give you quite a blow by blow because we aren't very good at taking notes. We're better at drawing fish, as you can see. So we focused on issues related to capture, figuring out how many fish, and some related tangents. We spent some time at the beginning thinking about balancing the negative consequences to the individual versus the positives to a population. That's in the context of mission-oriented conservation or management type research, and that seems to be an area where a lot of the big asks for numbers come from. There's not a lot of fundamental work going on that's asking for big numbers these days. One of the things that we thought about with capture gear was the need to evaluate proficiency. So there's a lot of gears out there, and they range from everything from a spear gun to electrofishing and so on. And we can't assume that that just because one knows how to claims to know how to use it, that they actually have the relevant expertise and are truly good at it. So whether that means target practice for folks working with spear guns, or accumulating a certain number of electrofishing seconds to go along with the actual certificate that one can have, that seemed to be important. Public perception was something else we spent some time thinking about. This idea that, for example, in zoos and aquaria, there's a group of members of the public that are really concerned about animal welfare and issues of ethics. And then we also have other groups, for example, recreational anglers or commercial fishers, that are users of the resource, and they may view things very differently. But the point is that that we're interacting with those folks in various ways, and that may influence the type of gears that are acceptable and the messaging that we need to do around that. So Dr. Murray brought up the idea that there's certain gear types that would not be endorsed by his organization because of the collateral damage that those would have, and they just didn't fit with the mission of the organization, as an example. With respect to capture, anything that can be done to minimize stress or injury seemed relevant, and then also sharing that so that we can help refine. And I've got the R underlined here. We think that that's probably the most the most obvious place for improvement with respect to capture. It's somewhat difficult to go out and say, I'm just going to catch fewer fish today, because many of the gears simply don't work that way. There's the odd thing where you're targeting an individual, but many cases it's however many you get, and you have no idea what you're going to get until you cast your net, essentially. So there's opportunity to refine those the gears themselves, or how they're used, or the behaviors of the team members. And so that means perhaps thinking about doing pilot projects or side projects where you're actually studying or comparing different gear types, and at the end of the day looking at which outcomes are best for the fish. Related to that, we think there's a general lack of understanding gear technology within the animal care community. There's a lot, and in fact, you can do an entire degree in gear technology. That's a thing. That's a field of study. Fisheries engineering and gear technology. So it's a big area, and we need to think about two things: but the welfare side of things and the environmental impact. And I guess human safety we'll tack on there as relevant as well. Sometimes this is dictated by the scientific collection permit, but literally there's a book called Fisheries Techniques I showed you before, and it's basically a whole guidebook of all the different ways you can use to capture fish. It's unlikely that every member on the animal care committee will have a strong understanding of all of those techniques and their subtleties and strengths and weaknesses and so on. So the PIs need to do their homework and make sure that they put forth a compelling case, and that may mean saying, although there are a suite of techniques that we explored, including A, B, and C, we've settled on this one because. We spent some time thinking about intercepting fish from capture gears or platforms that are problematic. So perhaps something like a bottom dragging trawl or something like that. It might be a great platform. Maybe you can get on board for free. But at the end of the day, what message is that sending, unless you're there explicitly to study that and look at those consequences? What else do I want to say about that? Yeah. we spent a fair amount of time talking about sample sizes. How do we best determine or justify a given sample size? Seemed to be no one-size-fits-all answer, other than needing to make sure that one provides a compelling case that's backed up, ideally, by something like a power analysis combined with an evaluation of what others have done in the literature, realizing that that may not be best practice or the way one wants to go, but it's at least some guidance. And then there may also be some practical considerations. So the amount of funding you have, or if it's a partner project with a government agency and they have expectations re what's needed to be management relevant. And that sample size may in fact be higher because they need that, if you're studying a population of 10 million fish, maybe you could do a power analysis that says you can get by with 3 groups of 10 for a comparative study. There's challenges in trying to extrapolate that up to the population size, especially given the inherent variation in biotic characteristics, like I covered in my presentation before. What about the boys versus the girls? What about the fish of different maturation states and so on? So in wild fish and wild animals, we need to oftentimes have bigger sample sizes to account for the inherent biological variation that we know exists in natural populations. When animals are essentially duking it out day and night for food and resources, unlike what we tend to have happen in captivity. And then thinking about the factors that influence whether sample sizes need to be justified by power analysis. Power analysis certainly isn't necessarily universally accepted. There's a well-cited paper on the fallacy of power analysis, but again, you can find literature that will support or refute that as an appropriate way to go. So we were thinking about whether or not things that were more hypothesis-driven or had an experimental framework would obviously fit relatively nicely into the power analysis context, whereas things that were more discovery-based or surveillance probably wouldn't as much. And that's where, again, interactions with partner agencies, if it was mission-oriented work, could be useful in helping to dictate sample sizes. And I think that's all that I have. Anybody else that was in that group would like to add more? Okay. Do you want to elaborate on any of those? I didn't want to write down the euthanasia stuff because we're going there tomorrow again. So, yeah. But that's my excuse, at least.
The legal public perception topic about representing your institution and the risk aversion that may be there. And there was also, here, hold on. There was talking about the EHS interaction and that how sometimes the IACUC has no problem with something, but then EHS and legal might have concerns about the project activity because, the institution has insurance, and will the insurance cover the activities that are being done? And then also the international arena, where sometimes when you're in international waters and you haven't connecting it to euthanasia about throwing the fish back or not, what's allowable or not, and when you're on a boat with your organization's decal on it. And talking also about state regulations or laws surrounding permits for recreation versus scientific permits. And then Steve also talked a little bit about interacting with indigenous people and their expectations, their ethical review process. That's it.
Thank you. We only took notes for the first 2/3. So. Thank you.
Okay, good afternoon. My name's Ann Kemtrap. I'm a veterinarian with the California Department of Public Health. I'm not on an IACUC, so I volunteered to take this because that's going to take the notes because that's going to make me really try to understand what a lot of you folks are dealing with. I do have to submit protocols, so that helps me as well. So we looked at three main scenarios. One involving misnetting, or actually harp trapping. What were they called? What was that trap? Yeah, trapping bats, and then another one was using net guns from helicopters for moose, and then another one using leg traps in an urban setting for bobcats. And basically, out of those scenarios came some very common questions, and then each one of those scenarios had very specific considerations. So as these protocols come across your desk, the first question that always comes up: does the protocol need a review? Is the protocol needed? Is the protocol needed at all? Does it fall under the IACUC purview? And the major points that came back out of that is that it comes back to considering the touch points of, is it invasive, harming, or altering the environment for the animal? Pointed out that there's 3 different standards: the USDA standard of invasive, harming, or altering. The PHS standards are more explicit. And then looking at the mammal guidelines, there is apparently an italicized phrase in there. I didn't get a chance to find it, but it emphasized that any activity should be reviewed for regulation definition. And it may be a self-imposed regulation, but this may protect researchers. So the bottom line is that the IACUC should debate and document their decision and bring in experts, including the PI, to help decide if it needs any kind of review. So some of the mechanics on deciding if something needs a review, and different institutions pointed out they have different approaches. Some have an evaluation algorithm at the beginning of their worksheets that help the PI and the researcher determine if it needs this kind of review. And there's different thresholds for different institutions. One institution said any capture equals altering the environment and it would need a review. Doesn't necessarily mean it has to be reported. Blood from the periphery would be considered something of a field study. Blood from a heart stick would be something that had to be reported. Anesthesia just for handling the animal, for the safety of the researcher and the animal, would be considered a field study, while anesthesia for pain relief would be something that would have to be reportable. Our marine mammal folks had a slightly, it seemed to have a much lower threshold, and basically anything requiring any kind of permits or any kind of handling seemed to require a protocol. And anybody can jump in and correct anything I'm saying here. That's not what I captured correctly. So some of the specific examples and considerations in face of these scenarios that we evaluated. One of the scenarios had NSF funding, so that was an automatic trigger that you would go ahead and review. Potential adverse events may trigger a review, such as bats and harp nets catching endangered bats, and issues related with mist nets. When you have moose net gun from helicopters and anesthetized for handling and collared and peripheral blood, theoretically that's a field study, but the dramatic and very visual approach of doing it may require the protocol to assure the welfare of the animal. So you may want to have a protocol from the institutional perspective to protect the institution and the research, but USDA reporting numbers may not be required. And then the bobcat one involved extracting a tooth. So that automatically kind of triggered a inclusion of doing a protocol. A statement that came out of that discussion was, don't underestimate the impact of the court of public opinion, which I think was covered in both of those sites. And that can encourage the requirement of a protocol to protect the institution, researchers, students, and so on. And then also outlined was that the delineation between research and management can often be fuzzy. And there's an article coming out in ILAR that talks about the interplay between the public process and wildlife research and management. And is that article going to be included in our notes, or is that something that maybe we can mention down the road? So then all of those scenarios involved considerations about trapping and restraint. We talked a little bit about adverse events. So for protocols, that whose numbers are reportable, what is reportable is if the adverse event is related to the study. But if it occurred not related to the study, then it's not a reportable event. The question came up about non-target species and encouragement to list a best guess of what you might be seeing could include, and if your non-target species included a potential of threatened and endangered animals, then the protocol did need to be reviewed. In the bat studies, we talked about listing all the potential bat species that could be caught in that area. And in the bobcat study, there was a consideration with these padded leg hold traps that you have domestic dogs that may be, or dogs or cats that may actually be non-target animals. And so one of the questions is this the best trap? What would you do to minimize that possibility? And again, I think that was the major non-target issue related to that. And then should part of the protocol evaluation include what do you do if you come across a sick or injured animal that's not part of the study? So one institution described they had a really interesting standard called the functional three-legged standard. If you had a animal that could get out in the environment and was fine, and this is injured not due to your study, but something that you just happened to find, then go ahead and release. And another statement is that nature is a tough place. It's part of the big circle of life. Let it go out and do what it was going to happen to it anyway. And then exceptions would be as if you came across certain diseased animals like rabies and distemper, you may want to actually euthanize those so as not to spread that if somehow you can determine that in the field. Decontamination procedures should be asked about. For example, nets should be able to be decontaminated due to white nose syndrome in bats. Questions came about concerning collaring. So are they the right size for the age animal? Are they going to grow into it? Male deer, for example, will go through cycles where their necks will get quite large. Make sure the collar would fit that. How long does the collar stay on? Could it come off at a later time? And there's all these kind of alterations that can be made for that. We also discussed some occupational health concerns. Considering, for example, physical issues, we've talked about those before, the environment, but when you see things like mist-netting bats, don't assume it's just at ground level cave. Are they climbing up in canopies in order to get their species of interest? Jumping out of helicopters and shooting a net gun has its own host of occupational health concerns. And our appropriate zoonotic disease prevention considerations taken into place, rabies, pre-exposure, prophylaxis, and so on. And the point with occupational health, and as all of these, is call in the experts as necessary, and that will also help not getting caught in discussing a lot of what-if scenarios. If you have your expertise, your expert there, they can really address those things quickly. So I think the bottom line and the take-home messages were to debate, discuss, and document any decision in need for taking for actually doing a protocol and taking into account those important touch points of the invasive harming and altering and keeping the animal welfare primary in mind. And also to bring in experts and consider the PI as an expert. And that's what I covered. And if anybody else has anything they want to add, please go ahead.
Excellent. And I guess we'll follow up with reptiles and amphibians. And of course, we're the most Halloween focused, in my opinion. We have hellbenders, we have eyes of newt, and we have Gila monsters, right? So we didn't give specific scenarios. It sounds like Dr. Sykes did provide those to you. We did have some handouts, and these are, I believe, on your thumb drive as well. And if anybody wants these, I'll put them up front for people to take with them later. But we did talk through probably some of the most consternation is about numbers. You know, how do you go about deciding what a scientific justification is and how to report numbers for a lot of the studies involving herps. And so we had great discussions about, again, explaining what the intention is for the research. So Mike brought up there's definitely different types of studies that can be conducted in the field, some which can very easily have statistical analysis done for them, and others that we don't know until we know. So, and we've talked, I know a lot about this, a lot of the other groups, sounds like went through some of the same question and answers about how to come up with these numbers. And what I would just say is to the IACUC members, as well as to the PIs, is provide as much information as you can as to why you came up with your numbers. And then estimate a maximum number, knowing that you may need to come back and modify that later. So I think we talked about that a little bit yesterday as well. So numbers we talked about for a while. We talked about capture and handling, different types of techniques, showed some pictures which are on those handouts as well of some standard techniques that are used. And again, recognizing, I think especially with fish, we talked about this, it looks like in your group about the different types of techniques that can be used, and making sure that if you are setting things up in the field, for instance, drift nets and pitfall traps, that you're not leaving those out in the field either unattended or open, so that there could be significant effects on the environment or on the individuals in the area that you've set those traps up. So when you're done with your study, remove your traps, or if you're not done but you're still going to be closing traps, make sure that they're provided for in a way that you're not going to harm animals inadvertently. We talked quite a bit about bycatch, and I think it's, again, sounds like everybody talked a little bit about this and whether or not it's something that needs to be reported to the IACUC in advance, as well as what would need to be reported if there's, for instance, adverse events. So we talked about different mechanisms to go about with providing that information in the best way possible to the IACUC, but it's not required because those are not your study animals. So it's not required to be reported to the USDA if they're mammals. In our case, we're talking herps. It's something that the IACUC can certainly request, but do you really need estimates on the numbers of all the different species, or just those species of concern? For instance, maybe an endangered or threatened species in the area that could be captured. That might be something for sure to list. I think Ernie made a brilliant point in that a lot of our IACUCs that don't do a lot of wildlife research, and even those that may have one or two members on the committee that have some wildlife background, there's so many different variables, so many different species, so many different things that can happen within all of our different wildlife activities, that your IACUC is maybe inadequate to really address all of those concerns in an effective way, to really do a thorough review of protocols involving wildlife studies. So getting your PIs involved early on to provide education to the committee members, getting your committee members trained, coming to meetings like this, or doing city modules, or looking for other resources available that can provide some good guidance. The fisheries book that you mentioned with techniques in there, have those resources available to your committee members, and ensure, again, I think one of the questions we had too from one of our group members was, how do you know that the PI is doing what they say they're doing, or how much do you trust the PIs to say that they've checked that box and that they're really going to follow decon procedures in the field appropriately, or some of the other techniques that we're concerned about. And I think we all agreed that we need to, at some level, trust those PIs. They're experts, but if you don't, that's where post-approval monitoring and inspections and accountability, maybe more frequent reporting to the committee, especially if there's a high level for pain and distress associated with those particular capture techniques. What else? Biosecurity. I know it's been mentioned a few times, but yeah, we delved into biosecurity as well, especially with regard to the target species. If we're looking at amphibians, chytrid fungus concerns are certainly there, but there's resources available that your PI should know about if that's their area of expertise, to look up the USGS map and find those areas that are likely to have hotspots for chytrid, having a risk evaluated protocol for moving from area to area when they're out there doing field work, to ensure that they're not likely to be a fomite or a mechanism for transmission of those infectious organisms in the field. But also for the rest of you that aren't amphibian and reptile folks, realize that you're moving through areas that might have those types of organisms, pathogens. You also could be a potential transmission mode for some of these diseases. So if you're working in wetlands or you're doing work where snake fungal disease has been detected, but your target organism isn't one of those organisms, again, thinking about how you're looking at biosecurity for your own species of concern, but also for the environment as a whole. That's something that I think we really wanted to make sure that folks have resources for, and we didn't have them for this session. I know that I sent them to Linda, so hopefully we'll have them for tomorrow, but it should be on your thumb drive. There's some recent publications out there specific to reptiles and amphibians about exactly that, biosecurity in the field, flow charts on moving from a high to a low risk situation or situations that you don't know what the risk is because it hasn't been surveyed yet. So there's resources out there. And again, this meeting, we're helping give you a lot of these. We're making a lot of connections with individuals here. Use all of us. I mean, each one of us has resources that you may not know about that we can help you with. So don't hesitate to reach out if your committee's running into a problem or there's a new protocol, new area of interest from a researcher, and you don't know where to go for the answers. Use your colleagues as well as your the PIs directly. What else? Those are the main things. We didn't get too much into the capture because we talked a little bit about that, I know, in some of the session yesterday with the collared lizards. So we didn't get too much into it other than showing some pictures. But anybody have anything else to add from my group? Awesome.
One of the things that we actually did talk about a little bit that was elicited from one of these scenarios was stress versus distress, particularly when we were net gunning moose or net gunning anything. And when you're interacting with a wild animal, obviously you are going to be a stressor. You are a potential threat to that animal. And this is particularly true when you're net gunning from a helicopter. So we talked about how that stress could be pushed into distress, capture myopathy, and how to mitigate that. And it really comes down to pursuit times, and those pursuit times are specific to the time of the year. So stress is what keeps these animals alive, but when it becomes distress because you're stressing them to a level that they can't cope with, that's when it becomes really problematic. And that's the push between C, D, and E for the USDA reporting as well. It's pain or distress.
We owe you some claps.
You talked about stress and distress. So if we look at the AWA definition of a field study, would you say stress is a normal part of the animal's behavior? If you move into a distress, you have therefore altered their behavior, therefore it's not exempt. Would that be a reasonable statement?
All right, so we're into the free-form component. So at this point, we can certainly take questions from the audience. People would like to have follow-on comments to anything they've heard, any additions, things they'd like to play off of, common themes that emerged, questions. So have at. I'm looking for a hand.
So specifically for the bird group, but it could be for any of the groups, the concept of live bait animals. So my question, sort of some history why I'm asking this. In my previous institution, we had a protocol that was looking at predator home range within the home range of squirrel monkeys down in Argentina. And with looking at the predators, they were going to put live chickens in cages and such. And our IACUC at the time decided, looking at the stress-distress issue, in hindsight, I think just looking at stress, but the IACUC decided that those chickens should only be used once and euthanized, understanding that we'd use more chickens for bait, but we're not allowing chickens to experience that level of stress/distress multiple times. So I just kind of wondered what the general consensus or individual opinions might be on that.
You want to take that?
So as you can imagine, this is used mostly in the context of raptors. They are in a double enclosure cage, so there's no way on Earth that the raptors can actually get to them. That doesn't mean that they don't feel the fear. I'm not going to get into stress versus distress, which we can't measure in the field. It would not be feasible. But the strong consensus among the raptor people is that the animal, the lure animal, you use the word bait. It's not really bait in the sense that the animal is not meant to be eaten. It's a lure animal. Is generally used no more than 4 hours and then rested for the rest of the day until the next time period the next day. There's variation among different lure animals and different raptor species, but yes, they're absolutely used again. They are given food and water and shelter within that double enclosure, so they are able to hide just as they would in the wild if a raptor came at them and they had no protection. So it's not as though they're sitting there and they can't run and hide. There is protection in the cage where they can run and hide just as they would do in normal circumstances.
So interestingly, in terms of the fish work we do, we use rod and reel quite frequently to catch fish, so recreational fishing gear. And what I put in my protocols ends there. So we'll use hook and line or rod and reel. And at the end of the day, whether we use live bait, could be a dew worm or a cyprinid, a minnow, whatever is legal, it's what we use. So it's interesting that we've never sort of thought of putting bait in that context, even though we use whatever is working to catch the fish. All right, other questions or comments?
Wondering if, for those of us that are less familiar with the federal definitions, it seems hard to believe that net gunning a moose from a helicopter and anesthetizing it could fall into something that doesn't require a protocol because it's being defined as a field study. Could we review the definition of a field study and where that actually applies legally or maybe even philosophically?
Stay tuned. We'll be talking about that later today.
All right, anyone else?
I do want to add, we did talk a little bit about that in our session too with regard to materially altering behavior. And there's no published definition to give us better guidance at this time from animal care. So it's really up to your institution to come up with the best way to define that makes sense for the program that you have and the type of work that you're doing. So, and we've defined it a certain way in National Park Service. I'll be talking about tomorrow as well.
I have the AWAR's field study definition here that says a study conducted on free living wild animals in their natural habitat. However, this term excludes any study that involves an invasive procedure, harms or materially alters the behavior of an animal under study. And I was talking with Julie here about how if you do a field study on a marine mammal, it's the same as a field study on a kangaroo rat, but does it mean that the protocol does it get submitted, or does your IACUC have an alternate review process? And that was a conversation that the mammal group had.
As an outsider,
Speciesism.
as an outsider, these words all have different meaning to different people. So outside of this room, I think there'd be a lot of people scratching their heads. The field is the field, I think, to most ecologists, and so and certainly in Canada we have different terminology. So it's either research or not. I think so. Yeah. So my guess is that as an informed or relatively informed group, it seems to be a confusing topic. I think you're probably the minority. I think this is probably confusing terminology for most.
Anybody else? Questions, comments? Got 5 minutes? Oh, Bob.
On this field study, one of the things that we hammered over and over and over is it's really critical for your institution, for your IACUC, to debate on these issues, to deliberate, and to document what you're discussing here. And what's important is the process. And two different IACUCs can review the same protocol and come up with two different decisions on whether it is or is not exempt. And they're both correct. If you go through the process, provided you are not, I mean, obviously doing something that's invasive materially alters behavior or harms the animal. But again, it's the IACUC that is making the determination of those definitions because they are not defined in the regulations. We did have extensive discussions on that. And one of the points was, is a field study when you're trapping and releasing mice different than a field study where you're trapping and releasing moose just because of the size of the animal? Are you materially altering the behavior? So are you changing the behavior of that animal after it gets away from that? And is it fundamentally, are you fundamentally changing the behavior, how it reacts the next day, the next week, etc.? The size of the animal shouldn't be the determining factor, megafauna versus microfauna. Granted, when you're net gunning from a helicopter, there's a heck of a lot more risks. And it's very easy to go beyond not materially altering behavior or not harming the animal. A great example is this capture myopathy. So it's really easy to be chasing an animal long enough in warm enough conditions that you can push them into that distress. Whereas it is probably not as easy to do that when you're trapping a Paramiscus in a Sherman trap. But the size of the animal is not the determining factor.
So the question I always deal with is we deal with a lot of invasive species. So it's just a starling or it's just a feral swine, but it's the animal welfare that is really important.
Is it coffee time?
Anyone else? Come on, now this is usually a very, very interactive group. Elaine?
Yeah, all the blood went to my stomach. To go along that field study definition or the idea of going out and doing just mark and recapture, what if you have a wildlife management group that is taking the research that was done by your conservation department and implementing it? What would your IACUC do? What is the purview there? Because again, if you look at some of the not FAQs, the Q&A done with USDA in recent years, I would encourage you, if you're USDA registered, to check out that inspection guide manual and look at the annual report section and really parse out what is covered, because based on their input, that mark and recapture, and for the management part, they're not saying the IACUC shouldn't review or discuss it, but that you should have a process in place that allows your PI some flexibility there, because they are mandated by the state or the federal government to manage invasive or feral species. They're mandated to manage Batriciceps, or sorry, the chytrid fungus somewhere. And so it's just something, if your institution only has a protocol form for the IACUC to review something, then could there be another accommodation? Because there are other institutions that have groups that don't fit that box.
So to that point about the IACUC only having a protocol form was actually part of our discussion in the mammal group, in that for those institutions who are moving in a direction of maybe not requiring a protocol for some of these, there's still an IACUC review of the activity, in the sense of, like Bob was saying, in his protocol form, the first page or two is a list of questions that may be all they need to fill out if the answers are appropriate for, okay, you don't need a protocol. The OLAW FAQ A6 says, For field studies, the investigator must provide the IACUC with the following information: where the activity is conducted, what procedures will be involved, a brief description of those procedures, a brief description of how those procedures will likely affect the animal, and the assurance that permits are in place. That doesn't mean you need a protocol. That means you need to address those 4 things, and the IACUC needs to review that, which can be done in a page or less, not a 20 or 30-page protocol. I mean, that was a lot of the discussion we were having.
And that's why we have that field study form that we've developed for Park Service for exactly that reason.
And there's another fine point that I want to make too. It's not that a protocol is not a good thing to have. It is more to the point of what is covered on the USDA annual report. Remember, we were talking about wild mammals. They're all USDA covered species, provided it doesn't fit the field studies exemption. So whether or not it's a field, whether or not it fits that regulatory exemption for a field study doesn't determine whether or not it needs a protocol for coverage of the institution, for coverage of the investigator, but it may determine whether or not those animals need to be reported to the USDA on the annual report.
Anyone else? We really want him to have the final word? Apparently so.
Awesome. Well, thanks
Thanks, everyone.
everybody.